Platform, it's Rowan, and today I'm talking to Lev Rosen about LGBT sex education. I guess specifically talking to you because of your book, Jack of Hearts and Other Parts.
Jack of Hearts is about 17-year-old Jack Rothman who lives in New York City, goes to a very liberal private school, and has a lot of sex with a lot of different guys. He has no interest in settling down, but this sex life becomes fodder for the school rumor mill, and because of that, his friend Jenna asks him to write a sex advice column on her blog. But it gets him a secret admirer whose notes become creepier and more controlling as they essentially try to force Jack back into the closet. And the sex advice column is actually throughout the book, the questions and the answers. And many of the questions were sourced from actual teenagers.
Amazing. So I guess like the first prompt or question to start with is, why is sex education important for LGBT students?
Sex education is important for pretty much everyone, especially a more progressive form of sex ed, one that emphasizes stuff like consent and pleasure, as opposed to sort of the traditional fear tactics about diseases, pregnancy, and how to put on a condom. It's especially important for queer people because that basic fear-based sex ed usually doesn't cover them at all. As sexual education progresses, what's important is this emphasis on pleasure and consent. What I really wanted to do was make sure that when I started talking about sex ed in the book, I wanted to make sure that it was giving teenagers sort of an alternative queer sex ed from pornography. Because I feel like since queer teens aren't getting any real sex education in schools, the only other place they're turning these days tends to be porn. And you know, I have no problem with ethically made porn, but it is...
It's not an educational tool.
Yeah, it's not an educational tool. It is a fantasy. There's a lot of stuff that is happening off screen that, you know, if you don't know about it, you're just, and you think if you think porn is real sex, and you go and you like are gonna have your first sexual experience and it doesn't work like that, that's one of those moments where you are going to feel really broken. And especially for queer teens who already feel sort of broken sexually because that's what the world is telling them all the time, I think that that first experience, having such a disconnect between expectations and reality, is going to be really disheartening and really damaging in many ways. And that's not to say that if they had real sex ed the first time would be like the most magical experience in the world. First times are almost always going to be awkward and hilarious. But I think that if sex education actually focused on that and said that queer sex is valid and all sex, you know, can be awkward and funny and still good, then I think that queer teens are going to go into their sexual experiences and they're going to be a lot more prepared.
So this is the interesting thing, is that I feel like a lot of queer sex education should also probably have been included in the straight sex education. So like if we're talking about oral sex, right? If we're talking about rimming, if we're talking about fingers, like all of these things are things that straight people can still do during sex that might be considered like specifically, or even anal sex. All of those things should ultimately be covered in sex education for everyone, but it's sort of seen as a cis man's penis goes in a cis woman's vagina, and that is what sex is.
That's it. It's only seen as sort of a procreative kind of thing, procreative and disease. Like I feel like those are the two things that are taught. There's all this stuff that no one has ever really taught. And it's because there's no focus on pleasure. If sex ed were really just about pleasure and consent, which is what it should be, we would have so many people who would like be willing to explore their own bodies, straight, queer, whatever, explore their own bodies, get to know what they want, and then even more importantly, be comfortable asking for what they want.
And I think there's a big crossover between consent and queerness in that if you're being told sex is a penis and a vagina, if that isn't how your sex life is going to go, you have such an opportunity for communication to work out, okay, so what do our bodies do together when we have these particular like bodies? How is that going to work? And so that discussion, that conversation can actually be something that's really wonderful, that actually including queerness and sex ed and in those conversations means that ultimately there's sort of this liberating experience potentially for for anyone who might be having sex.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. Everyone, straight people included, can take advantage of that if they're just given the tools, and we're not giving them the tools right now.
We've kind of talked about the idea of sex ed at the moment isn't necessarily kind of giving knowledge to people who need it, but I feel like we also already have an idea that's pervasive in society about queerness and sex in general, right?
Yeah.
The sexualization of queer people. Can you talk a bit about that?
Absolutely. The idea, I mean, you see it all the time. You see it anytime on television where there are teenagers or even adults, straight teenagers, essentially get to simulate sex on TV, teenagers in television for teenagers and younger get to essentially have under the covers simulated sex, and we all understand what's going on. Meanwhile, two boys make out leaning against the wall, and that's considered just as sexual because the innate sexuality of queerness is apparently super porny.
So much,
right away. Two guys hold hands, it's erotic now. And so I think that because we have this over-sexualization of queer teens, one of the things that this hetero-patriarchal society tries to do is it tries to tell queer people that there is a proper way to be queer. I call it the glass closet, this idea that essentially even in a really liberal environment, and Jack of Hearts takes place in a liberal private school in New York City, just like the one I went to. And even in these liberal enclaves, there's this idea that you can come out and there will be people all around you saying essentially, oh, I love gay people, so proud of you, I'm pro-gay marriage, etc., etc. But the moment you start behaving in a way that they feel is the bad gay, the moment you step outside that glass closet, you are suddenly, you'll get stuff like, oh, I love gay people, but do they have to be so in your face about it?
Or I'm okay with gay shows for adults, but do we have to put them in kids where kids can see it?
Kids can see it, as though kids don't see heterosexuality all the time. What was is Sesame Street a big deal over here?
Yeah, we watched.
Okay, good. That'd be worrisome. But there was the thing with Sesame Street where someone was they asked if Bert and Ernie were a queer couple, and they said, no, we don't have any sort of sexual, couples. It's for kids. There's no sexuality at all. But there have been plenty of straight couples on Sesame Street. They're usually played by humans, not puppets, but they have definitely existed. But somehow those are viewed as neutral.
Yeah.
Straight is neutral. Queer is suddenly a controversial relationship.
Yeah.
It's showing something.
I mean, what would you say to people who are well, in schools, at the top estimate, 1 in 10 kids might be LGBT. Why should we bother talking about this in the schools,
Well, they should go see my old high school. I talked to a teacher there, and they said, oh yeah, 30%. Even assuming 10%, that is still 10% of students. Every student counts, and even more importantly, putting aside all that, how do you educate straight people against homophobia? By showing them that queerness is perfectly natural and showing them that it's part of history. Educating about queerness isn't necessarily just for queer people. Just queer books aren't just for queer people. That's how you end up with, strong, thoughtful, genuinely considerate people.
How far was your kind of frustration at this situation and which is coming out a little bit in the video, how far did that go into the inspiration behind the book or writing it?
I mean, it's definitely a book of queer rage. There's no getting around that. When people are what's the impetus, I was very angry. No, I think that a lot of where it came from was, if you look at a lot of queer YA today, and there's a lot more of it, which I love, but I felt like I was seeing just 3 categories, and there was this 4th that I wasn't seeing anything in. And the 3 categories I was seeing were queer romance, like very sweet, cinnamon roll kind of stuff, and it's super important because queer people, young queer people, need to be able to see themselves falling in love. And I was seeing what I call sort of incidental queerness, which is stories that are really about, that are like mysteries, or they're dramas about family stuff, or trying to get into college, and the character is queer, and maybe they had a love interest, but if you switch that love interest gender, nothing would really change in the main section of the book. And that's also important because young queer people need to be able to see themselves doing stuff that has no regard on their sexuality. And then I was seeing a lot of coming out novels, and I felt like there was this sort of missing category of the non-coming out but still very queer book. And that's why, you know, the tagline, I've been saying essentially, it's not a coming out novel, it's a staying out novel. Because once you're out, it's not all rainbows and sunshine. Like, you're still living in this straight world that is telling you the correct way to be gay. Why are we either in these cute romantic situations or you know, non-sexual situations? So I was like, where's the gay guy who's fucking? It really sort of came from a place of missing a category, and also, yeah, rage, queer rage. Queer rage is a great place to draw inspiration from.
Thanks so much, Lev, for joining us.
Thank you.
If you have any thoughts about what we've covered in this video, please leave in the comments below. We would love to hear them. And just to let you know, Junk Parts and Other Parts is available to buy right now, if this has whet your appetite.